Hi, my name is Frank, and the experience I'm going to tell you about today is one of the scariest and most bizarre things I've ever experienced. It all started when I decided to buy a new car so I could continue my job as a cab driver. One day, around 8 o'clock at night, I was in the middle of a hamburger when my phone rang. It was a customer, so I answered quickly. But on the other end, I heard nothing, so I thought someone had made a mistake or was just making fun of me, and I hung up. But after 5 minutes, the same number called back. But I was met again with the same silence. Then I received a message. The person apologized and said the signal was weak, so he sent me his address. I was surprised to see that it was a mountainous area outside the city, and for a moment I thought about refusing the service, but in the end I told myself that it couldn't be that bad and decided to go pick them up. I was driving along the mountain road near the place when the car's engine suddenly stopped. Great, I thought, as I got out of the car and checked under the hood for the possible problem so I could fix it. However, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the car to start even remotely. So I sent a message to the customer saying that I was stranded, hoping that he would have some compassion and send someone to help me. After that, I called a rescue service, but the wait was long and agonizing. I was in the car for about 20 minutes, looking around, waiting for the tow truck to arrive. The fog was so thick I could barely see, but then my eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and that's when I realized something was moving toward me. At first, I thought it was the rescue team approaching, but when I got a better look, I realized that they were wandering shadows slowly approaching. It was too strange. They were figures that looked like humans, but really were not. I froze as I noticed that their silhouettes were small and hunched over, and suddenly, an icy air came over me. It felt as if the temperature had suddenly dropped and a shiver ran down my spine. I stood there shivering and waiting, having no idea what to do in the middle of the night, and with that thick fog enveloping me. I checked the car doors but was startled to remember that the passenger side window was open, so with trembling hands I pulled up the glass. But at that instant, an arm appeared from outside. It was long, thin, and covered with hair, and quickly grabbed the door, producing some grunts and strange sounds. At that moment, I realized it was the screams of a monkey. That creature was right in front of me, and panic completely overcame me. Quickly, I started kicking towards that arm, trying to get it to let go. Fortunately, it worked. The monkey got scared and quickly withdrew its arm. At that moment, I decided that my best option was to take shelter inside the car and try not to make any noise. Then everything became eerily silent. It was as if those monstrous shadows were right on the edge, waiting for me to make a mistake. The windows were completely fogged up, which made seeing out almost impossible, but I needed to know if they were still there. So I tried to calm down, but fear paralyzed me. I felt like I couldn't move, but still, with my heart pounding, I decided I had to find the courage to face whatever was lurking in the darkness. I had to steel myself. No monstrous monkey was going to get me. Truth be told, I was completely scared, but I knew I couldn't just stand by, so I took a deep breath, thinking it was now or never. But just as I was about to do something, I saw some strange footprints on the fogged windshield of my car. They were handprints or footprints. I wasn't sure, but they didn't look like anything I had ever seen. At that moment, I started to hear some strange mumbling coming from outside, and from the tone of those sounds, it was clear that those monsters were still there. The way they were shrieking made me think that they weren't exactly looking to be my friends. They sounded furious, so the only option I had was to close my eyes, cover my mouth, and wait for them to scram. The technique seemed to work. After about 5 minutes, silence returned, and I was relieved that those little beasts had finally taken off into the woods. I tried to calm down and turned on the windshield wipers to clear the mist from the glass. But as soon as the fog lifted, horror came over me completely. There were a bunch of monkeys on the road, dozens of them, all standing and watching me as if I were an undesirable enemy invading their territory. Their gazes were terrifying, and I could tell those eyes were bright red, as if they were planning to turn me and my car into their dinner. But the worst was yet to come. Just as I was beginning to recover from the scare, a monkey jumped towards my car and positioned itself right in front of me. only the windshield separating us as it glared at me with a murderous fury, showing those razor-sharp teeth and letting out some horrifying noises. That beast was drooling and looked really aggressive, like a rabid dog. At that moment, I felt that my heart would jump out of my throat at any moment. My hands were shaking and I was completely paralyzed with terror. I was praying for the rescuers to arrive soon because something told me that those huge monkeys were hungry and wanted me to be their dinner. That's when I remembered the fried chicken thighs I had bought for my wife, and without thinking too much, I rolled down the window and threw a couple at them. To my surprise, it worked. The damn monkeys stopped looking my way and started wolfing down the food, fighting each other for a portion. A small victory, I thought, as they slowly walked away from my car. But my relief was short-lived. Moments later, the monkeys began to turn and look at me again, as if I had made a fatal mistake in giving them food. Suddenly, the animals lunged towards my car again with a ferocity that left me paralyzed, and I nearly had a heart attack as I saw my car shudder, while that pack of monkeys began to beat the windows brutally with their little hands, threatening to break them. I was now in absolute panic, on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But just when I felt completely lost, suddenly a great light illuminated the place and the bunch of monkeys shot off in all directions, disappearing into the darkness as fast as they came. "Thank God," I said in a whisper. The rescue team had arrived just in time, and those freaks ran into the forest at the sight of the people. I was so relieved and grateful that I almost cried like a baby right there. After that, I took my car to the shop, but the bad news came fast. It was completely destroyed, and there was no way to repair it. I stared at the car, which was now covered in these strange hand and paw prints. Were they really monkeys? Or were they some kind of monster? The true nature of these creatures left me traumatized. I never even thought about driving on those lonely mountain roads again. The experience stayed with me, reminding me that there are things in the world that should never be disturbed. I'm going to start telling you this story by being very honest. I'm not one of those people who believe in urban legends. I have spent my whole life driving, covering miles and miles of road, and the only thing I have seen are accidents due to tiredness or recklessness. But there is a story that all truck drivers in the area know, something that I did not take seriously until I experienced it firsthand. There is talk of a certain Lilith, a woman who appears on the road if you are alone, especially during the early morning hours. Truckers describe her as a girlfriend with a pale face and a blank stare, who gets into your truck and asks you to take her home. But what happens next is what made me laugh when I heard other truckers talk about it. They said that those who took her ended up dead in unexplained accidents, overturning their trucks for reasons that made no sense. Now my story started one Tuesday night. The road was clear, the night was quiet, and the radio was playing in the background, but that's when I noticed something strange was going on. My radio started to fail. The stations would cut out and fill with static, so I tried to change the chain, but none of them worked. It wasn't the first time this happened, so I didn't worry too much. It just bothered me a little, and I turned off the radio to concentrate on the road. However, at one point I felt the temperature inside the truck plummet. It was a horrible cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, and even though I was alone, I suddenly felt less isolated. That's when I turned to my left and saw a woman sitting in the passenger seat. She was as real as the road in front of me. She was wearing a dirty, torn wedding dress. Her skin was pale, and her long black hair fell messily over her shoulders. Her eyes were completely dark, as if they stretched beyond normal, and she looked at me without blinking. I panicked at the sight of her. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself in a whisper, but my body would not obey. I wanted to open the door and jump out, but my hands gripped the steering wheel without my having any control, and though my mind screamed, I could not move or look away from the terrifying figure beside me. Finally, she spoke. "Take me home," she said. Without thinking, I stepped on the accelerator without really meaning to, as if someone was controlling my movements, and no matter how much I accelerated, she was still there, motionless and not looking away. Suddenly, the road became a blur in front of me, and I found it harder and harder to stay on course. Every meter I went, I got closer to some death warning signs that began to appear on the road, but I couldn't understand what they said. I felt like I had forgotten how to drive on the road I had traveled for years. I had never felt so panicked in my life. Desperate, I knew that if I didn't find a way to stop, if I didn't do something to get that woman out of my truck, I wouldn't see the sunrise. So I decided to talk to her. It was the only thing I could think of at the time. My lips were dry and my voice was shaky when I finally managed to ask, "Where is your house?" I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear her answer, but at that moment, I couldn't think of another way out. As I got closer, she pointed ahead, indicating that there was no way, as the road went straight and there were no turnouts in sight. Confused, I looked toward her, searching for some sign that I might have misunderstood, but her expression did not change. Desperate and terrified, I decided to keep going, hoping that perhaps I had made a mistake and that the road lay ahead. But after a few seconds, no exit or sign that I should turn off appeared. The atmosphere in the cabin became heavy and the air felt heavy with tension. A shiver ran through my body as I noticed the woman watching me with an anger I had never seen before. Her face showed a menacing air, and her eyes seemed to glow. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Didn't you hear me? Are you making fun of me?" Fear began to grip me and my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I tried to explain, stammering that I had found no way, but before I could finish, she moved quickly, bringing her face close to mine. "Take me home. Take me home. Take me home. Take me home," she repeated with terrifying intensity. His scream was so loud that I let go of the steering wheel for a second and the truck swerved sharply. I struggled to regain control, but it was too late. The vehicle began to slide down the wet road, and suddenly I felt gravity shift as the truck began to overturn. Everything was happening in slow motion for me, and the screeching sounds of twisting metal mingled with the woman's piercing screams. Then my body was thrown violently against the cab, hitting the steering wheel and the roof as everything spun. Finally, after all that torment, the chaos stopped in abrupt silence and the world faded into darkness. When I awoke, every inch of my body ached. There was blood on my face and a constant ringing in my ears. After a moment of confusion, I realized that the truck was overturned, and I was trapped in the seat, hanging by the seatbelt. But at least I was alive. As best I could, I managed to unbuckle it and fell to the cab floor with a groan of pain. My vision was blurry, but I could see the lights of the approaching rescue vehicles. How long had I been unconscious? I tried to move, but every attempt made me feel a stabbing pain, so I could only wait for the rescuers to get me out of the wrecked truck. Once outside, they placed me on a stretcher and began to check my injuries. I wanted to tell them what had happened, how that woman had made me roll over, but I barely managed to mumble a few words before a paramedic gave me something for the pain, and I fell almost unconscious. Weeks later, when I finally managed to explain what had happened to my fellow truckers, I expected them to laugh at me, thinking that the bump had made me hallucinate, but to my surprise, they were angry. "Weren't you carrying someone with you?" I was so confused I didn't know what to answer right away, but then one of them continued. "Everyone who works this route knows you don't travel alone at night, especially here. Didn't you have one of those mannequin dummies or something you could have used?" I mumbled, unable to believe that no one was surprised by what I told them. I didn't understand how the idea that a ghost could just jump into your truck out of nowhere had become second nature. But then they explained to me that you never leave the passenger seat alone on that route, that if you don't have someone with you, you should occupy that spot with a dummy, a stuffed animal or something like that, but never alone. From that night on, I decided that I would never drive alone after dark again. At first, it was weird to drive with a stuffed animal as a passenger, but I preferred that to having a ghost woman next to me. I never spoke of what had happened to me that night to any human being again, although I did listen to others tell road legends as if they were common stories. I realized that there was something strange about all this, and that, although I didn't want to believe it, there were unspoken rules in the world of truckers that were far from common. such as never traveling alone at night and above all never ignoring the girlfriend of the legend. I now knew that the story of this woman dressed as a bride was more than a myth. It was clear that she could appear on any road and in any truck, and I had been lucky or unlucky enough to experience it firsthand. I'm on a trucking route that runs from Connecticut to Kentucky to Tennessee. The truth is that the road is pretty interesting because I pass through a lot of iconic East Coast places, but there is one area that gets pretty weird, especially near the Appalachian Mountains. You know, it's one of the areas with the most economic problems. What happened with coal mining really tore communities apart, and it makes me very sad to see some families trapped in poverty. The other day, I was trying to get around a part of West Virginia that I had never traveled before, an alternate route that I had to detour through thanks to a giant accident on my usual route. Unfortunately, there were some casualties in that crash, so the road was completely closed. So there I was, trying to get my bearings without GPS because my phone ran out of battery, and as if it was a joke of fate, the charger decides to fail just then, so I had to drive my 18-wheeler on very small roads, which sounded like a lousy idea to me. For a while I managed because I have years of experience in my trade and I can boast of being a good driver. But eventually I felt completely lost and started to worry about not being able to make my delivery on time. And you know how things are, that means trouble and fines I can't afford. Well, in the midst of that angst, I see a guy walking along the side of the road and decided to stop and ask him if he knows how to get back to the main road. The guy turned out to be quite friendly and even took the time to give me the necessary directions to get out of that situation. The truth is that I felt very lucky to have found him, and then, since I was hungry, I asked him if he knew any place nearby to eat something, because it was already past lunchtime and I had only had a very light breakfast. The guy stood there thinking for a while, scratching his head as if he was having trouble remembering. "It's tricky to find a place to eat in a place like this," he said. Finally, the man told me he knew of a family restaurant that supposedly made the best fried chicken in the county, and at that point, it was all worth it. I accept that I'm from up north, but believe me, I wouldn't say no to a good plate of fried chicken, and if it's with fries, much less. The problem is that I was trying to remember how to get there. I was already getting a little impatient, but within a couple of minutes he remembered and gave me a couple of directions down a dusty old avenue, which gave me a little bit of a scare. Such a road could get my truck stuck, but after a while he explained how to get to an old shopping center. He mentioned that the place was almost abandoned, but the restaurant is still standing along with some small businesses. He warns me not to be surprised if the place looks empty during lunch, as they tend to work more in the evening. I was feeling a bit excited, so I thanked him and set off following his directions. It took me some time to find the old mall, which turned out to be a bit frustrating, especially since I passed several chain restaurants where I could have stopped. By now, my stomach was already clamoring for some good homemade fried chicken, and I felt that fast food places were no match for good family cooking. Finally, after much searching, I arrived at the apparent mall the guy told me about. The truth is that I was not disappointed, but I was surprised. The place was in a sorry state, far away from any major road, and there were no signs indicating that there was such a thing, and to top it off, I didn't see the slightest trace of an open restaurant in any of the stores. That was one of the most confusing situations I had ever experienced, and I couldn't help but feel a slight shiver inside me. However, I had rolled around quite a bit to get there, so I wasn't about to give up just like that. As I wandered around the old mall, I saw a huge sign that said something like Grandma Lila's Kitchen, and suddenly my spirits rebounded. Just then, a guy came out of the restaurant and stared at my truck. From where I was standing, I didn't think he saw me, maybe because of the sunlight shining in front of him, but he kept looking at me, and that gave me a bad feeling. At that point, I got out of the truck and approached the guy in the parking lot to ask him if they were really open, but he didn't say anything and just kept looking at me in a way that was quite uncomfortable. My stomach dropped, and I felt a chill tell me that I should turn around and go back the way I came. I was starting to get an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right, like I had walked into a bad place. At that moment, the boy turned around and suddenly pulled something out of his back pocket, which at first I mistook for a wool cap. But as I put it down, I realized it was something else, a ski mask. But it was what I saw in his other hand that chilled me. The guy had a revolver. At that moment, I panicked and started running back toward my truck, but when I turned around, I realized I wasn't alone. Other guys appeared from the abandoned cars and came straight toward me, each with some kind of weapon, whether it was a knife or an iron bar. I couldn't believe it. The adrenaline rush I felt made me run even faster, managing to jump into the truck and closing the door just in time, almost by miracle. My heart was racing as I desperately searched for the keys. In an instant, the guys surrounded my truck, banging on it and yelling at me to get out. Then one of them, the one with the revolver, pointed directly at my face through the windshield, demanding very aggressively that I get out. But I couldn't let myself get caught. I had to do whatever it took to get out of there. So in a panic, I started the engine, and with a jerk I accelerated, trying to run over those who didn't manage to move in time. As I leaned forward to get control of the steering wheel, I heard a shot that shattered the windshield right above me. The guy had fired, and thank God missed me by millimeters. However, I couldn't let the shock get the better of me. I made a sharp turn in the parking lot, hoping I wouldn't get shot again, and when I looked in the rearview mirrors, I saw some of the men lying on the ground with obvious signs of pain, and that gave me a slight relief to know that I managed to get out of there. However, I kept speeding blindly until I found a safe place to park, and when I finally did, I called the police, my hands still shaking with fright. I spoke to a sheriff's deputy who told me that I was not the first to fall into the clutches of these criminals. It turns out that apparently this group of bandits had been harassing truckers in the area for some time, trapping those looking for directions. The deputy seemed surprised when I related how the guy who gave me the directions ended up being part of that whole gang. After that, I decided to refuel and look for a place to get something to eat. I know it seems strange considering that I had almost just been kidnapped or killed, or something worse maybe, but the hunger was too much, so I needed something to calm my stomach, and why not? In the end, I ate a good plate of homemade food to shake off the fear. During the talk with the sheriff, I gave him details about the guy, and he just nodded his head as he listened to my description. He seemed to know the situation and told me that I should be very careful on the road. One of those pieces of advice that sound like a cliché, but now I understood that it was more than true. You have to be careful with strangers. You may think it's just a warning from your aunt on Facebook, but you really don't know what kind of people you'll cross paths with. After eating, I left the restaurant looking more alert, remembering how quickly the situation can change. I never thought a simple truck trip could end in a scare to death. So folks, if you're traveling on lonely roads, beware of strangers. Some are not what they seem, and sometimes just asking directions can get you into a mess that there's no way to escape. I stopped using cabs a year ago, just when I was 24. I was a community nurse at the time, and for a change, my coworkers were insisting that I go with them to a Christmas party. Not that I was really excited, as I'm not a big fan of bars and have always been stressed about the late-night commute home, but my boyfriend, who lived in the next town over, encouraged me to accept the invitation, so I decided to take his advice and give myself a chance to share and get to know my colleagues outside of work. In addition, he offered to pay for the cab back, so with a little encouragement, I decided to put on my heels, a nice dress, and attend the meeting. The party turned out to be more fun than I thought it would be, and after a few drinks with my colleagues, they asked me if I wanted to join them at a bar nearby. The truth is that I didn't feel very safe, but I knew I could return home without worrying too much, as I have always been very careful with my safety. In the end, the evening dragged on a bit. We were having a great time and the chats became very enjoyable. I must admit that I drank a little, and although I wasn't exactly drunk, I was already a little dizzy, but I was certainly enjoying the good atmosphere. When it was close to 1 o'clock in the morning, one of my companions proposed going home after the party, but I stopped to think. Not that it was a terrible idea, but I knew I was overdoing it. My boyfriend was waiting for me, And I also had to work the next day, so I thought it was a better idea to go home with my partner. I didn't want to inconvenience him by making him wait late for me, and knowing him, he should be well asleep by now, so I didn't want to disturb him either. So I decided to go out and hail a cab on my own. And after a short time of waiting, one pulled up in front of me. This is where things started to go wrong, starting because I made the bad decision to sit in the passenger seat. The driver didn't seem to be a local. He had a stubble, dark skin, and an odd accent that spoke in heavy tones. The conversation started well. The guy asked me if I had fun, but soon it all got weird. He started talking about the drinking culture in Norway and how women generally behave in a sassy manner with a few drinks on them, glancing sideways at me with a crooked smile. Immediately, an uncomfortable feeling settled in my body. I wanted to keep control of the situation because I didn't want him to see me nervous. As we continued driving, his questions became more and more personal. How about you? How about your man? How long have you two been together? Do you really like him, or are you just used to him and bored? That question took me totally by surprise. I tried to downplay it by saying that I didn't like to talk about it, that it was something too personal that I didn't share with strangers. But at that moment, the atmosphere in the car changed. A heavy silence took over the cabin, and I realized I had to be careful. When the traffic light turned red, he asked me to approach him. Then something inside me woke up and alarms started ringing in my head. He looked into my eyes and began to tell me that I had the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen. Then, still looking at me in an intense way, he moved his free hand closer and placed it on my thigh. At that moment, I knew I was in trouble. I started desperately thinking of a way to escape from that guy, and the first thing that came to my mind was to throw myself out of the car. I know it's too risky, but it was the first thing that came to my mind, probably because the alcohol wasn't helping me think clearly. So with my heart pounding, I started unlacing my heels and sliding my hand near the seatbelt latch, ready to jump out at the next traffic light. However, my nerves calmed as I began to recognize the streets, and we finally arrived at my partner's house. When the guy pulled into the driveway, still with his hand on my leg, I quickly unbuckled my seatbelt, pushed his hand away from my leg, and quickly paid without waiting for change. I didn't even listen to what he was saying. I just threw the door open and shot out of the car barefoot and with my heart in my throat. I arrived at the room with my breath coming fast. At that moment, my boyfriend woke up and asked me what was wrong, and still trembling, I told him what had happened. The experience was etched in my memory, and the next day I spent the day questioning whether I should call the cab company and complain, but the fear that the driver might trace my call stopped me. I didn't want him to make the connection and be able to track me down. I still remember that night vividly. I was terrified to think that, had I been drunker, the story might have been very different, and I felt a shudder at the thought of less fortunate women. 3 weeks later, I read in the newspaper that a cab driver had attacked a woman. That news made my blood boil. After I became aware of what had happened, I also remembered my friend who was almost dragged away by a cab driver who kept insisting that she have sex with him. So here's my advice. Stay alert, girls. Always have a plan to get home. Life can get dangerous all of a sudden, and safety is not something to be taken lightly. It was one of those days when the rain wouldn't stop, and after a long shift at the hospital, I climbed into my old truck and ventured back home. The windshield wipers struggled to clear the view, moving from side to side in an almost hypnotic manner, while the radio barely managed to make sound because of the rain pounding the bodywork. As I drove down a lonely road in the middle of a forest, with tall trees that seemed to want to trap my truck, the feeling of loneliness became more intense. My hands firmly gripped the steering wheel and my knuckles felt sore from the cold. I remember having my eyes fixed on the road, but my mind wandered, just wanting to get home and relax. However, as I rounded the first bend, my headlights illuminated something strange. It looked like a human figure in the middle of the road, so I stopped for a bit, intrigued and worried. As I looked again, I noticed it was a man, and his hair was messy and soaked. The man was about 4 or 5 meters away, standing still and staring at me, almost unblinking, as if studying me. His clothes were in tatters, adjusting to a body that looked weak. But then I noticed he was holding something in his hand. It was a long, shiny object that gave me the shivers. My heart started beating very fast, and although I wasn't quite sure what it was he was really holding in his hand, something about this situation told me I was in trouble. However, the guy wasn't moving, just staring at me. I tried to calm myself by taking a deep breath, as the steam built up on the glass, and I kept thinking about the strangeness of the situation. However, before I could make a decision on what to do, the man suddenly lunged towards me, hitting the hood of the truck hard. The blow made me jump in fright, and that's when I saw his face pressed against the windshield, his eyes wild-eyed and grimacing horribly. It was then that I saw up close what he was holding in his hand. It was a large syringe with a long, sharp needle, filled with a yellow liquid that seemed to flow with its own life. The man suddenly smiled, and his expression gave me chills. His yellowed teeth and reddened, wild eyes seemed to be a warning that this was definitely not right. Suddenly, the man threw himself against the car door and yanked it open, as if nothing could stop him. In that instant, I didn't know what to do, and barely had time to react before he tried to pounce on me. With my heart pounding, I watched as the syringe rose up, pointing dangerously towards my neck. At that moment, the adrenaline surged in me, and I struggled with all my might trying to pull away, but his grip was strong, almost inhuman. Confusion and fear invaded my head. Who was this madman? What did he want from me? I tried to think clearly, but I couldn't. I just wanted to get out of there. I just wanted to get out of there, as I listened to his laughter echoing in the cab of my truck full of madness. As I struggled to get the guy off me, I watched in horror as the needle came closer and closer. I fought like crazy, trying to keep him from injecting me with whatever he had in that syringe, until finally, in a last-ditch attempt to survive, I grabbed his wrist with all my strength and tried to get him to let go of the injector. So, with all the strength I could muster, I pushed the guy back with a kick and managed to pull him out of the cab. Surprisingly, the guy staggered, and the syringe fell out of his hands, shattering on the pavement. The yellowish liquid quickly mixed with the rain, creating an eerie puddle, so I took advantage of his carelessness to slam the door shut and quickly locked it. My breathing was heavy, and I feared what the man might do next. I watched him stagger and scream in frustration as he walked away, his voice echoing in the air, whining and cursing. At that moment, without further thought, I started the car and stomped on the accelerator, speeding away from that madman and whatever had just happened. My heart was pounding hard in my chest from the adrenaline coursing through my veins, but I tried to regain some calm by taking deep, slow breaths. When I finally managed to calm down a bit, I called the police and told them what had happened to me, and at the same time I rushed to the hospital trying to get some help, because those images of his unhinged eyes and his damn smile wouldn't leave my head. Finally, the police caught him, and I was informed that he was a guy who was not only trying to scare me, but had attacked other women in that same place. From that night on, I started taking a lot of precautions whenever I had to travel on the road. Taking care of myself became a priority. You never know what kind of crazy person is going to cross your path. I never knew what would have happened if I hadn't had the strength to fight. Life is definitely scary sometimes, and it's good to remember to always be alert and be prepared for anything. Let's talk about I-70 in Utah, that stretch between Salina and Rio Verde that stretches more than 100 miles without any services. No gas stations, no restaurants, no hotels, nothing. There are only a few overlooks to stop and stretch your legs and nothing else. That part of Utah is beautiful during the day. Don't get me wrong. The mountains are breathtaking and the scenery is a beauty. And at night you can see an amazing starry sky. But 100 miles is quite a stretch, especially when the sun goes down. Anyone who has driven there will tell you that there is usually not much traffic, even during the day, and when evening falls it gets even lonelier. In the middle of the night, You can drive for miles and miles without seeing another car's lights, and don't even get me started on the cell signal. The service here is lousy. It's not a place where you want to be stranded, especially at night. Just imagining your car breaking down in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles, is enough to make anyone think twice before venturing out. But unfortunately for me, I hit the gas because I was in a hurry. A little context. I'm from Nebraska, from a place known primarily for its college soccer team, the Cornhuskers. I was born and raised there and lived there until I was 25. Then I decided that since I was single and childless, it was time to get out and explore the world. So I got a job on the West Coast and moved. Most of my family is still in Lincoln, my hometown, so I try to go back and see them from time to time. One particular Sunday, around 2 p.m., I got a call from my mom. She told me that my grandfather, who had been in a nursing home since his stroke, was getting worse, and they didn't expect him to make it to the weekend, so if I wanted to see him, I had to go fast. Since I'd been out of work, this meant I had time to visit, but last-minute flights are a steal, so I decided to drive. I had done that trip before. It wasn't the coolest experience, but it was a lot cheaper. Fortunately, I had had my car repaired a few weeks earlier, so it was optimal. So there I was, packing up and heading out with my dog. The drive was uneventful for the most part, but as the daylight faded, I had to lament missing the beautiful scenery of Utah and Colorado at night. I love stargazing, but it's tricky to appreciate them when you're driving 80 miles per hour. Since I was in a hurry, I didn't stop to enjoy them, and instead started singing out loud to keep myself awake. We've all been there, right? After midnight, I finally arrived in Salina, Utah. I crossed the sign that warns you, no service for 110 miles. One of those reminders that clearly came from the city and definitely welcome to those not used to these roads. Some who get stranded walk to the gas station building, which happens several times a week. I'm one to take precautions, so I stopped at a gas station, filled up, and got back on the road right away. It had snowed recently, and although the roads were clear, there were piles of snow on the sides. Normally, I'm one of those drivers who gets excited and speeds up a bit, so on a stretch where the limit is 80 miles per hour, I was hovering around 90, except on the inclines, of course. After driving for about 30 minutes, I had passed some cars a while ago, but now they were so far away that I couldn't see their lights. Have you ever driven alone on a dark road and wondered how lonely you feel? When I'm in those situations, sometimes I like to turn off the lights for a moment and see how dark it gets. It's kind of freeing, almost therapeutic. But suddenly, as I was driving along quietly, I heard a loud bang and the car swung to the left. Before I knew it, the tire pressure gauge started flashing, so I quickly slammed on the brakes and brought the car under control. I pulled over to the side of the road and turned on the hazard lights. A tire had most likely blown out, and I knew what to do. I had been in that situation before. I got out of the car, and sure enough, I saw that the left front tire was completely flat. I tried to inspect the tire with my iPhone's flashlight, but it was still too dark. I checked my phone, and as expected, I had no signal. I rolled down the passenger side rear window to let some fresh air in while I worked on the tire change. Still grumbling, somehow I already knew that would mean I would have to leave the road with the spare tire. So with the wheel and jack in the trunk, and as I made my way to the front of the car, I froze. Someone was approaching me. The figure was barely visible in the light of the headlights and made no sound, but I watched as he came closer and closer until he was about 30 feet from my car. At that point, no other car had passed since I stopped, so after the initial shock of seeing another person, I wondered where it could have come from. The figure stood still, staring at me. Truth be told, it was scaring the crap out of me. Who was this person? Where was he going? And why was he just watching me without speaking? My dog would normally bark if anything moved, but he was weirdly quiet. I put aside the spare tire and with a shaky tone asked, hello? I hoped my eyes were deceiving me, but no. The person just stood there motionless, staring at me. My heart was beating a mile a minute. I couldn't shake that feeling that something wasn't right, but I decided it would be best to go about my business and not pay attention, but I couldn't do that. Even though I didn't want to, my curiosity pushed me to keep looking at that figure that was so still. The more I watched it, the more disturbing it became, and before I knew it, I had stopped moving, caught between fear and bewilderment. Finally, the figure took a step towards me, and although I was a safe distance away, I felt a shiver run through me, as if somehow I knew it was there. Just as I thought about getting back into my car and locking the doors, the figure opened its mouth but made no sound. In that instant, I knew I was in the middle of something strange, a moment I never thought I would experience. In the middle of a vast empty road in the darkness of night, I realized I was completely alone, and yet I was not. There I was, standing in front of that figure, and he wasn't moving an inch. The temperature was dropping below 10 degrees and he didn't even seem to shiver. "Hello?" I asked again, this time a little more forcefully. At that point, I began to wonder if this person needed more help than I did. I was about to ask, but I was barely about to open my mouth when I finally heard something. "Do you need help?" The man's voice was weak, and at that moment I knew it was a man. Although his voice didn't sound as deep as you would expect from someone his size, it was strange, but he still wasn't moving. "Where did you come from?" I asked, confused. I hadn't seen any car lights on the horizon, and I didn't remember how long I had been stopped, so I started walking slowly toward the front of my car, holding the iron crowbar I had brought with me. He made no perceptible movement but repeated, "Do you need help?" At that point, I stopped and tried to get a better glimpse of his features, but I couldn't see anything. Although one thing I noticed that made me even more uneasy was that he wasn't wearing winter clothes. I was dressed warmly in sweatpants and a jacket and still felt the cold. But this guy, who was there, was wearing a simple short-sleeve shirt and had his head down the whole time. I started to feel a little crazy, but he repeated, "Do you need any help?" His voice sounded even stranger, as if he was struggling to pronounce each syllable. I slowly made my way toward the driver's door. At least I could take shelter in the car and lock the doors. I had the spare tire, but I didn't consider myself a physically strong guy, and I knew that if things got ugly, I wasn't going to be able to do much in the face of her size. "Do you need help? Do you need help?" he repeated more and more urgently. Suddenly, he took a step toward me and continued to insist until he yelled, "Do you need help?" Faster now. At that point, I tightened my pace and rounded the car, looking for the door handle. But just as I was about to open it, a bright light appeared behind me. I turned immediately and saw a pair of headlights approaching down the road. My instincts told me to turn around, so I did. As I turned, I expected to see the man approaching, but he was gone. The possibility of seeing lights in my direction was a relief, but the missing guy kept me on edge. "Hello!" I shouted, but there was no response. The silence was overwhelming. After a few seconds of confusion, the oncoming car zoomed past. It didn't stop, and I didn't blame them. Who in their right mind would stop next to a car stopped in the middle of nowhere? I thought about flagging them down, but I was too stunned to make up my mind. As I tried to process the strange experience, I walked over to where the man was standing, approached and saw footprints in the snow starting where he had been, extending into the distance and disappearing down the road. I was still holding my tire iron, and using my phone's flashlight, I followed those tracks. They would go about 10 feet before turning and heading south, going off the road. I'm not dumb enough to follow tracks in the snow at 3 in the morning in the Utah desert, but damn, curiosity was killing me. However, at that moment, more headlights appeared behind me, snapping me out of my trance. So I got back in my car, changed the tire in a hurry, and got back on the road, albeit at a much slower pace. The rest of the trip was uneventful and uneventful. I didn't mention the encounter to anyone because, to tell the truth, I still wasn't entirely convinced that what I had experienced was not a mere hallucination. I had been driving for almost 9 hours straight, and that can definitely make you see things. But one thing was clear. I was not planning to drive like that again, neither at night nor in the desert. Since the pandemic, the employment landscape has changed completely around the world. If anything positive came out of that difficult situation that kept us all imprisoned for more than a year, it is that people left behind the idea of working in an office 5 days a week, and more have opted for teleworking, or better yet, working from anywhere in the world. In the midst of all this, a lot of new YouTubers have come to light who document their life in vans, creating a whole community of people who live this way. Fortunately, my wife Sarah was one of the first to decide on this adventure of living in a van instead of a conventional house. We rented our home and got ourselves a spacious van, ready to launch our lives on the road. To say we were newbies to the van world would be a huge understatement. We barely had a clue what we were doing. The few YouTubers we watched helped us learn the basics: how to shower, store our supplies, cook something decent, and do laundry. But beyond that, we learned everything as we went along. We didn't have children, so that wasn't an inconvenience, and our jobs were remote, so money wasn't a big issue. Generally, we spent most of the day driving around, looking for a good place to park around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Once we found a good spot, we would set up camp and finish the day working out of the van, taking turns driving. Life felt like a long road trip, but that doesn't mean we didn't face challenges along the way. Today I want to share the scariest episode that happened to us one night. I remember that day vividly. It was a bright and sunny day, and since it was Sarah's turn to drive, I was in the back doing my job. At that point, we found ourselves on a road surrounded by thick forest, and although it was a highway, it was quite narrow and almost deserted. As we drove along, Sarah suggested that we look for a good place to park and spend the night. I wasn't too sold on the idea. We were literally in the middle of nowhere and the sun was going down, and we had a strict rule about not driving at night. Finally, we found a small building on the side of the road and decided to park there. Sarah started preparing dinner while I set up our camp outside. Although our van is fairly self-sufficient and has plenty of room, we both preferred to spend some time outdoors. By the time I finished setting everything up, it was quite late and it had gotten very dark, so I used a small lamp and headlamp for myself. While I was at it, I suddenly heard a rustling in the bushes by the edge of the forest, just a few meters away from me. I knew there was wildlife here, so I tried to stay calm and kept working, but after a while I heard a rustling much closer. This time the sound was not normal. At that moment, a cold air rushed up my body and I knew something wasn't right. I got into the van and told Sarah about the strange noises I had heard, then grabbed our little video camera that we used to document the trips and continued to circle the camp. Just then, I heard a woman's piercing scream coming from the forest. This chilled my blood. I had never heard such a disturbing shriek, but I stood still, trying to investigate what was going on just ahead. Suddenly, the rustling sound came again and again, the shrill woman's scream. Then, loud footsteps began to be heard approaching from the forest. Leaving all the camping gear aside, I jumped into the van and closed the door behind me. Sarah was a little confused because she hadn't heard anything of what was going on. But just as I was about to explain, we saw someone peeking through the cracks in the curtains. Without a second thought, I dropped to the floor and stood there still. We heard the figure move around the van several times until finally someone knocked on the front door. Sarah had an expression of pure terror and I was scared too. In our travels, we had encountered some strange people, but nothing like this. We had a small gun stashed away, but now was not the time to look for it. We stayed on the ground waiting for that person to leave, but suddenly, we heard an alarm we had set up under the van. That meant that figure was there trying to get to the trap door. Then, the other alarm we had went off as well. At that point, we were completely lost. We only heard the 2 loud beeps of the alarms. Sarah hugged me, trembling with fear, but after a while the alarms stopped and everything was eerily silent. No screams, no footsteps, just the darkness around us. I slowly sat up and looked out the window, but everything was black and completely silent. So, I opened the door, very slowly, picked up the junk I had left lying around, and went back inside. Without further thought, we decided to get the hell out of there, completely forgetting our camping rules, and I reprogrammed the GPS, which pointed to a small town a few miles ahead. And there we were, finally able to park our trailer. Fortunately, that was the only freak incident we had in our life on wheels, but we will definitely never forget how scary that situation was.